They laughed, mocked, and humiliated Chuck Norris's family right there on a deserted road. The bikers thought they were dealing with a defenseless woman and her children. But the next minute, their father appeared and everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching this video from. The Texas sun was sinking low, painting the horizon with fiery shades of red and orange that bled into purple twilight. The sky stretched wide above the open road, a vast canvas that seemed endless, and the air shimmered faintly with the last heat of the day. On that lonely strip of asphalt, bordered by fields of tall grass and the occasional leaning fence, a family car moved steadily forward. Inside it, the atmosphere was warm and alive, filled with voices, laughter, and the kind of comfort that only a family truly knew. Chuck Norris held the steering wheel with his usual calm assurance, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of road ahead. Even in moments of peace, there was a quiet discipline about him, an awareness that never dimmed. His jaw was set, his posture relaxed but firm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen much of the world yet found his greatest peace in these simple drives with his family. Next to him, in the passenger seat, sat Gina O'Kelly, her hair catching the fading light of the sun as she turned to smile at the children in the back. Her presence radiated steadiness and warmth. She was the heart of this family, moving between roles with grace. Wife, mother, partner, anchor. Behind them, their children filled the back seat with noise and life. Dakota, their son, was slouched with a kind of casual confidence that came with being a teenager, though his eyes still reflected the discipline his father had instilled in him. He tapped his fingers against the seat in rhythm with the music playing softly on the radio. Next to him, Danilee and Hannah exchanged whispers and bursts of giggles, one teasing the other, until both broke into laughter so contagious that Gina had to shake her head and chuckle too. "Settle down back there," Chuck said, though his tone was more amused than stern. "I can barely hear the road over you three." "That's because you always listen to the road, Dad," Dakota answered, smirking. "It's like it talks to you or something." Chuck gave him a sidelong glance, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "It does. If you pay attention, the road tells you everything you need to know." "Like what?" Hannah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Like when to slow down, when to keep steady, and when to prepare for something unexpected," Chuck replied, his voice even. "It's not so different from life." The children exchanged glances, their father's words settling in their minds the way his lessons always did, simple but weighted with meaning. Gina reached over and squeezed Chuck's hand, their fingers briefly intertwining before she let go. For a moment, the car was filled only with the hum of the tires and the low music from the radio, the kind of peace that could almost trick you into believing nothing in the world could break it. But the road has its way of humbling even the most prepared. It started as a faint rattle beneath the hood, subtle enough that only Chuck noticed. His brow furrowed, though he said nothing immediately. The children were still laughing, their voices carrying in the confined space, and he didn't want to break the mood with needless worry. Yet within minutes, the rattle grew into a shudder, and the temperature gauge on the dashboard climbed higher than it should have. The air conditioning faltered, blowing warm air that carried the faint smell of overheated metal. "Something wrong?" Gina asked, noticing the change in his expression. "Maybe," Chuck said calmly. "Engine's running hot." The car began to protest louder, the engine coughing as though it had caught a fever. Chuck eased it toward the shoulder of the road, the tires crunching against gravel as the vehicle slowed to a stop on the wide, empty stretch of highway. The children leaned forward, peering out the windows with curiosity rather than fear. For them, this was just another unexpected pause, something that would no doubt turn into a story later. For Chuck, it was a problem that needed a solution. He stepped out of the car, the heavy Texas air clinging to his skin, and moved to the front. The hood groaned as he lifted it, releasing a burst of steam that curled into the fading sky. The smell of hot oil and burning dust filled the air. Dakota slid out of the back seat to stand beside him, shielding his eyes against the glow of the sunset. "Overheated?" the boy asked. "Looks like it," Chuck confirmed. "Radiator's thirsty. We'll need water to cool it down, maybe a tool or two." "Where are we going to get that out here?" Dakota asked, glancing up and down the empty stretch of road. There's a gas station about a mile up, Chuck said, his voice steady. I'll walk it. You stay here with your mom and sisters. Dakota wanted to argue, to insist he go too, but the firmness in his father's voice left no room for debate. Chuck shut the hood, wiped his hands against his jeans, and walked to the passenger side. Gina rolled down the window, concern etched into her features. You'll be careful, she asked quietly, though she knew better than anyone what kind of man she had married. I'll be back before the stars come out, Chuck assured her. He leaned in, brushing a kiss against her temple. Keep them close. Don't let anyone near. Her eyes lingered on his as she nodded. We'll be fine. The children watched as their father started down the road, his steps steady, his figure growing smaller against the horizon with every stride. His silhouette cut a strong, solitary image against the backdrop of fading light. Even in something as ordinary as a walk down a rural road, there was an air of unshakable certainty about him. To his family, he was more than a protector. He was a promise that no matter what came, they were never truly alone. Back by the car, Gina busied herself with keeping the children calm. She spread a blanket on the grass beside the shoulder, handing them snacks from the cooler and encouraging them to enjoy the strange little adventure. They laughed again, though this time more softly, the unease creeping in despite her best efforts to shield them from it. Every so often she glanced down the road, her heart steadied only by the thought of Chuck's words. He would return. He always did. The cicadas sang their endless song, the fields swayed in the evening breeze and the world seemed still. The kind of stillness that feels almost fragile, as though it could break at any second. And far down the road, though none of them knew it yet, the low growl of engines began to rise in the distance. The night was not going to remain peaceful for long. The stillness of the Texas evening held for a time after Chuck's figure disappeared down the road, swallowed slowly by the lengthening shadows. Gina sat on the blanket with her daughters close. Dakota perched on the hood of the car, as though trying to imitate his father's vigilance. The cicada's constant buzz carried across the fields. The sky darkened from molten orange to deep indigo, and the faint scent of warm asphalt lingered in the air. For a brief moment, it almost felt like they were simply camping on the roadside, waiting for their father to return with his sure, unhurried stride. Gina tried to keep that illusion alive for her children, telling small jokes, reminding them of the pie they had bought earlier, nudging them toward laughter. But every few minutes, her eyes wandered down the stretch of empty road, searching for Chuck's silhouette against the dying light, steadying her heart with the knowledge that he would return, as he always did. The first sound of disruption came faintly, almost blending with the hum of the insects. A low, throaty rumble, distant but growing, like thunder far off on the horizon. Dakota stiffened and lifted his head, listening with the sharp attention of a boy taught never to ignore what others dismissed. The rumble grew, multiplied, became a chorus of engines, heavy and guttural, gnawing at the silence of the evening until the very air seemed to vibrate. Gina noticed her son's expression shift, and she heard it too, her pulse quickening. Headlights appeared down the road, beams cutting through the twilight in jagged patterns as a row of motorcycles surged into view. Their presence shattered the calm with brute force, engines growling as though they belonged more to beasts than machines. The children turned to look, Hannah instinctively clutching her mother's arm, Danielle shrinking closer to her sister. Gina drew them both near, her own heart thudding, but she straightened her back and lifted her chin. She would not show fear, not here, not in front of her children. The bikes slowed as they approached the stranded car, gravel crunching under thick tires. 7 of them, massive men astride hulking machines, leather vests covered in patches, arms sleeved in tattoos that disappeared beneath rolled-up shirts. The leader, a tall figure with a shaved head and a skull tattoo that stretched up his neck to his jaw, cut the engine first, the others following his lead until the sudden quiet pressed unnaturally hard against the ears. They dismounted slowly, as though savoring the moment, boots scraping against gravel, eyes glinting with something darker than simple curiosity. "Well, well," the leader drawled, his voice deep and thick with mockery. "Looks like the little family broke down. Where's Daddy, huh? Left you all alone on the side of the road?" His words fell heavy, laced with the kind of deliberate cruelty meant to unsettle. Gina met his gaze, her voice steady, though her stomach nodded. "My husband went to get water. We'll be fine. We don't need help." That earned laughter, sharp and unkind, bouncing from one biker to the next. One of them, broad-shouldered with a greasy beard, bent to pick up a stray pebble and tossed it lazily into the field. "Don't need help," she says, "sitting here with your kiddies like ducks waiting for the fox." Another leaned against his bike, arms crossed, eyes scanning the daughters with a gaze that made Gina's skin crawl. "Pretty little group you've got. Shame to waste such company out here." "Back off," Dakota said suddenly, his voice sharp with the courage that came from both fear and defiance. He slid off the hood of the car and stood straighter than his years, squaring his shoulders in imitation of his father. The leader smirked and tilted his head toward the boy. "Look at this one. Got some fight in him. Daddy must have taught him a thing or two before abandoning ship." He stepped closer, his boots crunching louder, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "Enough," Gina said firmly, stepping in front of her son, her arms instinctively pushing him behind her. Her voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that did not tremble even when pressed. "We don't want trouble. Just move along." The laughter returned, meaner this time. One of the bikers flicked a cigarette butt toward the blanket where the girls sat, the ember scattering in the grass before dying out. "Trouble's all there is on a road like this," he said, "and lucky for us, it found you." The men began to circle slowly, not rushing, savoring the unease they created. Their boots scuffed against the gravel, the heavy stench of oil and sweat mixed with the faint metallic tang that clung to their jackets. Hannah clung tighter to her mother, her face pressed against Gina's arm, while Danilee whispered something too soft to catch, her eyes wide with the kind of fear she tried to mask with bravery. Gina reached down, her fingers brushing both girls' shoulders, grounding them. "You don't need to be here," she said, her tone unflinching. "This isn't your concern." The leader laughed again, low and grating. "Out here, lady, everything's our concern. Road's ours, night's ours, even what's left stranded on it." His eyes slid to the children, lingering too long, his grin spreading slowly. One of the others chuckled, kicking at a soda can that had rolled from the car earlier. "Maybe we should teach them how the road really works." The air thickened with menace, the kind of silence that presses against your chest before a storm breaks. Gina's heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she refused to let her children see the terror clawing at her insides. She remembered Chuck's words, his endless lessons about focus, about staying steady no matter the threat. She drew on that now, lifting her chin, her voice even. "My husband will be back any moment," she said, "and you don't want to be here when he is." That brought another round of laughter, louder this time, filling the air with mockery. The skull-tattooed leader leaned closer, so close she could smell the sourness of his breath, the leather of his jacket, the gasoline clinging to him. "Lady, husbands break. Men bleed. Don't fool yourself into thinking he's anything different." Behind him, engines cooled with soft ticking sounds, like a clock marking down the seconds to something inevitable. The cicadas seemed quieter now, as though even nature held its breath. Dakota's fists clenched at his sides, every muscle in his young body screaming to lash out. But Gina's hand caught his arm again, firm, steady, reminding him of restraint. The circle tightened. The sneers widened. And the road that had seemed so endless and open just an hour ago now felt like a cage. They had been found, and trouble had arrived, roaring on 7 wheels of steel and leather. And though Gina did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of the storm. The laughter of the bikers still echoed off the fields, a sound that grated like metal dragged across stone. The air had grown thick with their presence, the fading twilight smothered by the weight of leather and oil, by the sneers curling across their lips. Gina stood her ground, her daughters pressed to her sides, Dakota slightly behind her, with his fists still clenched at his sides. The open road, once peaceful, now felt like hostile ground, and every second that passed seemed to push the family deeper into a shadow they had not invited. The leader of the group, the tall man with the skull inked across his neck, took a slow step closer, savoring the tension he commanded. His eyes roamed over the scene, the stranded car, the blanket on the ground, the small family holding tight together. He smirked and dropped a crushed beer can from his hand. The aluminum clattered against the gravel and rolled to a stop by Hannah's shoe. He pointed at it with his boot, his grin widening. "Pick it up, sweetheart," he said, his tone mocking. "Be polite and clean up after your guests." Hannah's lips trembled, but she stood frozen, unable to move. Dakota took a step forward instead, his voice sharp. "Leave her alone." The leader turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on the boy. "Oh, you're the little soldier, aren't you?" He crouched slightly, looking Dakota in the eye. "Think you're a man already? Think you can tell me what to do?" His words were low, poisonous, designed to needle their way into the boy's pride. Dakota said nothing, his jaw tight, his gaze unflinching, even as his heart hammered. Gina moved in front of him again, shielding her son with her body. "He doesn't owe you an answer," she said firmly. "And you'll keep your distance." The biker chuckled and rose to his full height, spreading his arms as though to invite the challenge. Behind him, another man, heavier and meaner, with a beard matted by grease, pulled something from his pocket and tossed it to the ground at Gina's feet. It was a wad of chewing gum, sticky and gray. He mashed it into the dirt with the heel of his boot, then leaned in with a grin. "Go on," he said to Donnelly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet your mom's taught you how to be helpful. Clean it up." Donnelly's face flushed with anger, her eyes flashing. She shook her head defiantly, pressing closer to her mother. "No." The biker's grin faded into a sneer. He bent lower, his shadow swallowing her small figure, until Gina pushed him back with her voice alone. "Enough." But their defiance only seemed to excite the men further. Another biker, broad-shouldered and missing 2 front teeth, sauntered over to the car. He dragged his hand along the hood, tapping his rings against the metal. Then with a sudden flick of his wrist knocked the cap from Dakota's head. The boy flinched as it landed in the dust. The biker laughed, shaking his head. "Oops, guess the wind caught it." Dakota bent to retrieve it, but the biker kicked it further with his boot, sending it rolling into the dirt near the wheels of a motorcycle. The circle of men erupted into laughter again, the cruel kind that twisted joy into something venomous. Dakota's fist clenched so tight his knuckles whitened, but Gina's hand was on his shoulder before he could move. "Don't," she whispered. "Not yet." The smell of gasoline hung thicker now, the tick of cooling engines mingling with the sound of boots scuffing the gravel. One of the bikers took a slow sip from a flask, then spat onto the ground near Gina's feet. "Out here, there's no neighbors, no cops, no one to stop us," he said, his tone casual. But the weight of his meaning sank like a stone. "Road belongs to us. And if we say this party's ours, then it's ours." Gina's heart raced, but she kept her expression calm, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My husband will be back soon. I suggest you leave before he arrives." That provoked another round of laughter, harsher this time. The leader tilted his head back and barked it out, then leaned close again, his face so near she could smell the sourness of his breath. "Lady, your husband's not here, and while he's gone, we decide what happens." His hand twitched at his side, a subtle threat in the way he flexed his fingers, as though itching for her to make the wrong move. One of the bikers wandered to the back of the car, yanking open the rear hatch. He rummaged through the family's bags with no regard, pulling out a box of food and tossing it carelessly into the dirt. A loaf of bread landed in the gravel, splitting its bag open. A bag of apples tumbled into the grass. "Look at this," he jeered. "Dinner's on the ground tonight." The daughters cried out softly, their faces twisted with shock. Gina tightened her hold on them, her voice rising for the first time. "Leave our things alone." The man ignored her, pulling out another box and hurling it to the ground. A folded blanket spilled open, its clean fabric instantly covered with dust. He grinned back at the others. "Maybe we'll camp with you folks. Looks cozy." The leader's eyes never left Gina's. He should have stayed. A man doesn't leave his family stranded, unless he's a coward. He let the insult hang in the air, waiting for it to wound. Dakota couldn't hold himself back any longer. "Don't you talk about my dad," he shouted, his voice breaking with fury. The leader smirked. pleased with the reaction. He stepped forward suddenly and shoved Dakota hard in the chest. The boy stumbled back, barely keeping his balance. The daughters gasped, clinging to their mother tighter. Gina's heart slammed against her ribs, her instincts screaming to act. But she held firm, her body a wall between her children and the men closing in. "Why are you doing this?" Hannah cried out suddenly, her young voice trembling with both fear and outrage. "We didn't do anything to you." The man with the greasy beard crouched lower, his eyes narrowing at her. "Because we can," he said flatly, his voice cold. "Because out here, no one cares about your little games." The words struck like a slap, leaving silence in their wake. The children's eyes glistened with tears, though they tried to stand tall, remembering their father's lessons. Gina's breathing was shallow but steady, her mind racing as she tried to calculate, to find some way to diffuse the moment without breaking. She knew restraint was their only chance until Chuck returned. Yet the weight of the humiliation pressed down harder with every cruel laugh, every careless hand that rifled through their belongings, every shove that reminded them how powerless they seemed in that moment. The men grew bolder, circling closer, their shadows stretching across the family like chains. The once golden evening had soured into something dark, heavy, suffocating. What had begun as taunts and jeers had turned into deliberate humiliation, and beneath it all, the threat of something worse loomed larger with every second. Still, Gina stood tall, her arms wrapped protectively around her children, her voice soft but steady as she whispered to them, "Hold on. Stay calm. He'll be back soon." But even as she said it, the bikers' laughter swelled again, carrying across the empty fields like the warning cry of predators circling their prey. And with each beat of her heart, Gina knew the night was only growing darker. The laughter of the bikers carried into the fading light like the growl of hyenas circling prey, feeding off the unease that draped itself over the roadside. The smell of spilled food and hot engines clung to the air, mingling with the dust kicked up by restless boots. Gina held her children close, her jaw set, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The humiliation of the past minutes had dug deep, but what unsettled her more than anything was the shift in the men's eyes. Their mockery no longer felt like play. Something darker now lingered beneath the sneers, the careless cruelty curling into something heavier, more dangerous. The leader, the tall man with the skull tattoo running up his neck, took another step closer. The twilight painted his features in harsh shadows, his smile twisted into something that promised no good. "Your husband's a fool," he said, his voice low, biting, "leaving you here all alone on our road. He thought he'd be back in time, but he won't. Not before we've had our say." Gina kept her eyes on his, her voice trembling only slightly. "We don't want trouble. Leave us be. You've done enough." Her plea only seemed to amuse them further. One of the heavier bikers with a thick beard, slicked by sweat, sauntered forward, the chain hanging from his belt clinking as he walked. He licked his lips, his grin wide and rotten. "Enough? Oh, sweetheart, we're just warming up." His hand shot out suddenly and clamped around Gina's wrist. His grip was iron, bruising, and his eyes glittered with cruel delight. The children cried out in unison, panic rising in their voices. Gina jerked back, twisting her arm against the hold, fighting to wrench herself free. "Let go of me!" she snapped, her voice sharp, stronger than her fear. But the man only tightened his grip, forcing her closer until she could see the cracks of dirt beneath his nails, smell the sourness of whiskey on his breath. "What's the matter? Don't like a little company?" Before she could push him back, Dakota moved. The boy surged forward, his face flushed with anger, every lesson his father had taught him battling with the instincts of youth. "Get your hands off my mom!" he shouted, his voice breaking but fierce. The leader's grin widened at the boy's bravery, feeding on it like fuel. He didn't stop his companion, didn't call him off. Instead, he barked a laugh. "That's the spirit, kid. Let's see what kind of fight you've got." The bearded biker released Gina's wrist abruptly, only to shove Dakota with both hands, a hard, merciless push that knocked the wind from the boy's chest. Dakota staggered back, his shoes scraping against the gravel, before he fell to the ground, coughing, clutching at his ribs. "Stop it!" Gina cried, throwing herself down at her son's side, her arms instantly around him. She glared up at the men, her fury blazing hotter than her fear. "He's just a child." The bikers laughed again, the sound crueler than before, feeding off the shock they'd inflicted. One of them crouched to snatch a bag from the dirt where another had thrown it earlier, tearing it open with a sneer. He pulled out sandwiches Gina had prepared and crushed them in his fist, letting the pieces fall slowly onto the gravel. "Looks like dinner's ruined," he said mockingly. "Guess you'll go hungry tonight." So another tipped over the cooler, sending bottles of water spilling out, rolling into the grass. He stomped down on one until it burst open, the contents gushing into the dirt. "Oops," he muttered, smirking. "Accidents happen." The daughters clung to Gina, their eyes wet with tears, their voices trembling as they begged the men to stop. One of the bikers, tall and gaunt with a scar cutting across his cheek, leaned down toward Hannah. His grin was malicious as he waved a finger in front of her face. "What's the matter, little bird? Don't you like the game?" "Don't talk to her!" Danilee burst out, her small frame rigid with defiance. She stood slightly in front of her sister, her voice shaking but filled with courage. The scarred biker sneered and bent lower until his face was level with hers. "Brave little thing, aren't you? Bet your daddy's real proud." His tone turned sharp, slicing at her composure. "But he's not here now. Out here, it's our rules." He lifted his hand as if to flick her forehead, but Gina pulled her daughters closer, her arm wrapping them tight, her eyes ablaze with fury. "Touch her and you'll regret it," she hissed. The men chuckled, enjoying the fire even as they stoked it higher. The bearded biker picked up a bottle of soda from the spilled food, twisted off the cap, and poured it slowly across the blanket where the children had been sitting earlier. The sweet liquid soaked into the fabric, sticky and wasteful. He tossed the empty bottle aside with exaggerated care. "Can't have you sitting too pretty, can we?" The leader finally stepped forward again, lifting his boot to kick at the cooler, sending it clattering against the car. He shook his head slowly, his voice carrying the tone of a man savoring the cruelty of the moment. "Look at this mess. Food on the ground, kids crying, mom trying to act tough. Doesn't look so perfect now, does it?" Gina rose to her feet, her arms trembling as she shielded her children behind her. "You've done enough," she said, her voice cracking but forceful. "Leave us alone, now." The leader smirked, his face inches from hers as he leaned in. His whisper carried the venom of someone who enjoyed every ounce of fear he provoked. "Lady, we'll leave when we decide to leave, and not a second sooner." His words cut through the silence like a blade. The dusk had thickened into night, the road bathed only in the glow of motorcycle headlights and the faint shimmer of stars beginning to pierce the sky. The family stood surrounded, their belongings scattered and trampled, their spirits pressed down beneath humiliation and pain. Dakota struggled to his feet, his chest still aching from the shove, but his eyes burned with fire. "You'll be sorry when my dad gets back," he muttered, his voice low but firm. The leader laughed again, tipping his head back. "Oh, I can't wait to meet Daddy. I really can't." His tone dripped with mockery, but there was a flicker of anticipation too, as if the thought of another fight thrilled him. The bikers began to pace restlessly now, their voices louder, their threats sharper. The sense of looming violence grew unbearable, as if the air itself was bracing for impact. Gina's hands shook as she kept her children close, her voice dropping to a whisper as she tried to steady them. "Stay strong," she murmured. "Just a little longer. He'll be back, I promise." But promises could only hold so much weight against the dark laughter closing in. The circle of men had shifted, their taunts giving way to hands that grabbed and shoved, to boots that kicked aside food, to grips that tightened too much. The first true violence had arrived, its shadow heavy on the road. And though Chuck Norris's steady stride was already bringing him closer, his family was caught in the storm, the first flash of danger sparking across the night. The air had turned heavy, suffocating in its thickness. Dust clung to the glow of the motorcycle headlights, casting long, distorted shadows of men who moved like predators circling prey. The laughter of the bikers had grown coarse, edged with menace, no longer playful cruelty, but something far uglier. Gina's chest rose and fell in quickened breaths as she stood before her children, her hands trembling though her stance remained firm. Every nerve in her body screamed to act, to tear her children away from the circle tightening around them, yet she held herself in place, knowing that one false move could unleash the storm fully. Dakota stood at her side, pale but resolute, his chest aching from the shove he had taken, his young fists still clenched in futile defiance. Danilee and Hannah clung to their mother's arms, their faces buried against her, their muffled sobs breaking through the night. The leader, the man with the skull tattoo curling up his neck, stepped close enough that the heat of his breath touched Gina's cheek. His words were low, deliberate, meant to wound. "You really thought this road was yours to take, lady? Out here it's ours. Your husband left you because he knew better. He knew you were nothing without him." She wanted to spit the lie back into his face, to tell him he knew nothing of her or the man she loved, but the words caught in her throat as another biker yanked a cooler upright and sent it crashing against the car door. The clang reverberated through the night, making the children jump. Laughter followed, loud and triumphant, as if destruction itself gave them life. Then in the midst of their mockery, another sound entered the night. At first it was faint, blending almost seamlessly with the ticking of engines. But then it grew distinct, deliberate, and steady. The crunch of boots on gravel, unhurried, unwavering. The kind of sound that carried not just presence, but certainty. The bikers heard it too. Their laughter faltered, their heads turning toward the road. The headlights caught a figure approaching through the haze of dust. He walked with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly where he was meant to be, carrying nothing more than a bag of tools at his side. The glow of the fading twilight outlined his frame, the wide shoulders, the purposeful stride. Chuck Norris had returned. For the family, the sight of him was like breath after drowning. Hannah's sob broke into a gasp. Danilee whispered, "Dad," her voice trembling with relief. Dakota's fists unclenched as though he had been holding his breath the entire time. Gina's heart surged with such force she thought it might break her chest open, and yet she held herself steady, her eyes locked on her husband as he came closer. Chuck's eyes swept the scene in silence. He saw the cooler overturned, the food scattered, the blanket drenched in soda, the belongings torn and trampled. He saw his wife's wrist, reddened where a hand had gripped too tightly, his son's shirt stained with dust from where he had been shoved, his daughters clinging to their mother, their faces wet with tears. And he saw the men, their leather vests, their sneers half hidden now by uncertainty, their bodies coiled with the arrogance of those who thought they would never be challenged. He stopped just short of the circle, setting the bag of tools gently on the ground. His silence was heavier than any words, his presence alone shifting the air. The leader broke it with a laugh, though there was an edge of unease in it. "Well, look who decided to come home. Daddy's back. Guess your little family couldn't keep it together without you." Chuck's voice, when it came, was calm, low, and edged with steel. "Step away from my family." The bearded biker barked a laugh, his grin wide though his eyes flickered. "Or what? You think you're going to scare us? You're one man. We're 7. Numbers don't lie, old man." Chuck didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his body still. "You've done enough. You will not lay another hand on them. Leave now." The leader smirked and moved closer, closing the space between them until he stood almost chest to chest with Chuck. "You don't give orders here. This is our road, and you're just another fool who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut." He jabbed a finger hard against Chuck's chest. "We told them this was over. Now we'll tell you." The neighbors' phones weren't here this time. No crowd to witness, no authority to hold the balance. It was just the family, the open road, and the men who believed they owned it. The bikers shifted restlessly, gripping their belts, flexing their fists, their confidence faltering only in the face of how utterly calm Chuck remained. Dakota took half a step forward, but Gina's hand caught his arm again. She shook her head, her eyes on her husband, silently telling her son to trust him. The girls clung tighter, their sobs fading into silence as they too turned their eyes toward the man who had never once failed them. Chuck's voice came again, softer, yet it carried across the night with the weight of stone. "You've had your fun. Now walk away." The leader chuckled, though it lacked conviction now. "Big words," he muttered. He turned to his men, gesturing with his chin. "Show him he doesn't get to talk to us like that." The bikers began to move forward, their boots crunching in unison, their eyes flashing with anger and bravado. Gina's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the night itself seemed to hold still, balanced on the edge of something inevitable. Chuck did not move. His stance was relaxed but unshakable, his eyes locked on the men closing in. His silence was not weakness. It was strength, coiled and ready. The family, trembling though they were, felt it too. It poured from him like a wall, unseen but impenetrable. The first biker lunged, chain swinging at his side. But Chuck stepped forward, his hand flashing with precision. The chain clattered harmlessly to the ground as the man staggered back, stunned by how effortlessly his strike had been deflected. Chuck did not follow through. He simply stood, his voice cutting through the air once more. "Last chance. Walk away." But pride is a poison, and the men were drunk on it. Another shoved closer, shoving the chair of the family's cooler aside with his boot, his fist tightening. The leader's grin widened again, sensing the fight he craved was seconds away. The children pressed closer to their mother, their eyes wide. Gina whispered, her voice almost inaudible, "Hold on, just hold on." And in that moment, with his family behind him and the predators circling before him, Chuck Norris took a single step forward. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it shifted everything. The air thickened. The men faltered for the briefest second. The balance had shifted. The storm had finally reached its center, and its reckoning stood with calm certainty in the middle of the road. The road seemed to shrink into silence. Every cicada, every rustle of the wind swallowed beneath the weight of what was about to happen. The air was brittle with tension, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. The circle of bikers stood just paces away, their leather jackets glinting under the harsh glare of their motorcycle headlights, their grins turned sharp, their arrogance bristling with challenge. Chuck Norris remained unmoving in the center of that light, his body loose yet coiled with control, his eyes fixed on the men with a stillness that unsettled them more than any display of anger could. Behind him, his family huddled close, trembling, watching with hope and fear that clashed in their hearts. The first man broke the standstill. He charged forward, chains swinging in a glittering arc meant to slash through the night. The sound of the lynx whistling through the air made the children gasp, but Chuck moved before the strike could land. His hand shot up, precise, controlled, snapping against the chain and wrenching it aside. The weapon fell with a heavy clatter into the dirt. In the same breath, Chuck's other hand struck out, palm flat against the biker's chest, not brutal but exact, sending the man reeling backward. He stumbled, lost balance, and hit the ground with a grunt that cracked the tension open. The others roared with fury. Another biker lunged with a wild punch, his fist cutting through empty space as Chuck pivoted smoothly, sidestepping with the grace of decades of discipline. The man's own momentum carried him forward, and Chuck guided him with the smallest of motions, twisting his wrist just enough to send him crashing into the side of the car. Metal groaned, the children flinched, but no harm came to them. The man slid down the door, dazed, clutching his arm. "Stop him!" the leader shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "Don't let him show you up." 3 men moved at once, their boots pounding against the gravel as they rushed him. The air filled with the sound of fists cutting through nothing but night. Chuck's movements were sharp yet calm, every motion minimal, every response measured. A punch was deflected with a forearm block, a kick caught and redirected. A headlong charge halted with a step aside and a swift sweep of the leg. Bodies hit the ground, groans mingling with the frustrated snarls of men unused to being resisted. Dakota's eyes widened as he watched. His chest still ached from the shove he had taken earlier, but now his father's lessons surged back into his mind: discipline, control, precision. Every strike Chuck made was not rage but intention. Even when surrounded, he remained untouchable, an anchor in the storm. But the bikers were relentless, their pride wounded too deeply to retreat. One pulled a knife, the steel glinting under the beams of the headlights. He lunged, teeth bared, blade aimed straight for Chuck's side. A collective cry broke from the children, But before the knife could meet flesh, Chuck's hands snapped out like lightning. His grip clamped around the biker's wrist. The blade halted inches from its mark. A twist, sharp and final, sent the knife spinning away into the dirt. And with a firm strike of the elbow, Chuck sent the man sprawling to the ground, his breath gone, his weapon lost. Gina's chest swelled with pride even through her terror. She knew these movements, had felt the steadiness of his teachings over the years. She had learned enough to recognize not just the skill, but the restraint. He wasn't trying to destroy them. He was dismantling them, stripping their power away piece by piece. The leader, face flushed with rage, finally stepped in himself. He swung with brute force, a fist wide and reckless. But Chuck didn't even flinch. He caught the arm mid-strike, their bodies locking for a heartbeat as the children watched. Breath held. Chuck's voice cut through the chaos. Calm, commanding. Enough! The man tried to wrench free, but the grip was unyielding. Pain twisted across his features as Chuck's hold tightened, not breaking but containing. With a firm shove, Chuck released him, sending him staggering back toward his men. The leader's bravado faltered for the first time, his eyes flashing with doubt as he steadied himself. But the chaos hadn't ended. Another biker lunged for Gina, his hand outstretched to grab her shoulder. Before he could reach her, Dakota moved. With a burst of courage, the boy threw himself between his mother and the attacker. His stance was clumsy but fierce, and his voice rang out, "Don't touch her!" The biker snarled and reached for him, but before the clash could unfold, Chuck was there. He caught the man's arm mid-motion, twisting it sharply and sending him to his knees with a cry. "You will not touch them," Chuck said, his words low, steady, every syllable striking with the force of a blow. The daughters, emboldened by their father's presence, stood taller behind Gina. Hannah whispered, "He's winning," her voice quivering with awe. Danilee clenched her sister's hand, her small shoulders squared as though she too felt a surge of strength pouring from her father. The leader growled, desperation breaking through his anger. "All of you, hit him, now!" But fear had begun to creep into the circle. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence slipping through their fingers. The ground was littered with their fallen companions, groaning, clutching arms, gasping for breath. The one with the chain hadn't risen. The one with the knife lay curled in pain. The others shifted, hesitant, their eyes darting between Chuck's calm stance and the wreckage of their pride. Still, pride demanded they try. One last man charged with a roar, hoping to land a decisive blow. Chuck stepped into the strike, caught his shoulder, and pivoted, sending the biker hurtling into the dirt with a force that left him gasping. Dust rose in a cloud, and when it settled, the man lay unmoving, his fight gone. Silence fell heavy. The headlights flickered across the scene of fallen men, their groans the only sound against the endless hum of cicadas. Chuck stood tall, his breath steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. He had not broken a sweat, yet the power of what he had done radiated from him, undeniable, unshakable. The leader stood alone now, his men scattered, beaten, stripped of their arrogance. His chest heaved as he glared at Chuck, but the fury in his eyes was hollow. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice shaking with the effort to hide the tremor of fear. Chuck's gaze was steady, his voice calm. "It is for tonight. Leave, while you can still walk." The leader hesitated, his pride warring with the truth his eyes could no longer deny. He turned sharply, barking orders at the few men who could still rise. Together they stumbled toward their bikes, dragging the fallen, mounting with effort. Engines roared again, louder now, more desperate, and one by one the machines peeled away into the night, their taillights fading into the darkness of the road. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. Gina let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The children rushed to Chuck, their arms wrapping around him, their tears soaking into his shirt. Dakota's voice broke as he said, "I knew you'd come back." Chuck placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him close. "I told you I always would." Gina met his eyes over the children's heads, her own filled with gratitude and pride that words could never capture. Chuck reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, anchoring them both in the calm that followed the storm. The road lay quiet once more, the dust settling, the night reclaiming its peace. But the memory of what had happened would linger, carved into the hearts of those who had lived it. The bikers had tried to break them, to humiliate, to dominate. Instead, they had been dismantled, not by rage, but by discipline, by the unyielding strength of a man who had spent his life preparing for moments just like this. And though the danger had passed, Chuck knew it was not the end. For men like those, defeat was a wound that festered. But for now, as he stood with his family safe in his arms, the night was his, and so was the road. The roar of engines faded into the distance until all that remained was the echo of gravel displaced under heavy tires. The red glow of taillights dissolved into the horizon, swallowed by the night. Dust settled in a fine haze, drifting slowly back to the earth, as if reluctant to let go of the violence it had witnessed. The cicadas reclaimed their song, cautious at first, then louder, filling the silence left behind by the retreating bikers. The storm had passed, but the memory of its force lingered like smoke in the air. Chuck stood in the center of the road, his chest rising and falling with calm, measured breaths. Around him lay the scattered remnants of the encounter: a broken chair, food crushed into the gravel, bottles cracked open and spilling their last drops into the dirt. The ground bore the scuffs and scrapes of boots, the faint indentations of bodies that had fallen hard and rolled helplessly. It looked like a battlefield, not of armies, but of pride and cruelty shattered against the discipline of one man. Behind him, his family clung together, trembling but whole. Gina stepped forward first, her eyes glistening with tears she had held back until now. She reached for his arm, her fingers curling tightly around it, not in fear, but in relief, in gratitude, in the unshakable bond that had carried them through countless trials. He turned to her, his gaze softening for the first time since he had appeared on the road. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice calm, though beneath the words lay the weight of certainty. But even as he said it, they both knew the truth was more complicated. The biker's threat still hung in the air, a promise spat in fury. This isn't over. Yet in that moment, with the children pressed close, with the night still humming around them, neither allowed the shadow of what might come to dim the relief of what was. The children rushed to him as though drawn by a force beyond their will. Dakota reached him first, his arms wrapping around his father's middle, his face pressed into the steady rise and fall of his chest. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice breaking, thick with both pride and the remnants of fear. Chuck placed his hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing firmly. "I told you. I always come back." Hannah and Danilee clung to him from either side, their small frames shaking as they sobbed into his shirt. He knelt slightly, pulling them close, his strong arms encircling them, shielding them from everything the night had held. He kissed the tops of their heads, whispering words they had heard all their lives but never needed more than now. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." Gina crouched beside them, her hand covering his, her other arm still wrapped around the children. Their family was a knot of bodies pressed together on the side of the road, the headlights of the motorcycle still glowing faintly on the horizon, the stars pricking through the dark sky above. For a long while they stayed like that, unmoving, letting the silence wash over them, letting the fear seep out with every tear, letting the strength of their togetherness sink in deeper than the pain of what had happened. When finally they began to straighten, Chuck turned his attention to the car. The hood still radiated faint heat, the engine waiting for water that hadn't yet arrived. Their belongings were scattered in the dirt, food spoiled, a blanket drenched in sticky soda, bags torn open. Chuck moved to gather what could be saved. He picked up the apples that hadn't rolled too far, brushed off dust from a half-ruined box, righted the cooler. His motions were steady, deliberate, not rushed. It wasn't the salvaging of supplies that mattered, but the quiet statement it carried. Nothing broken would remain scattered. Dakota quickly joined him, wordlessly lifting bags, stacking them back into the trunk. His movements were sharp, urgent, fueled by the need to prove he wasn't weak. Chuck placed a hand on his shoulder again, steadying him. "Slow down," he said softly. "Strength isn't in rushing. It's in control." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, and adjusted his pace. The girls began picking up smaller things, handing them to their mother. Gina shook her head at first, wanting to let them rest, but Chuck caught her eye and gave the smallest of nods. Let them help. Let them find their footing again. Together they worked, the act itself stitching back the torn fabric of the evening. When the last of what could be saved was placed back inside the vehicle, Chuck returned to the hood. He pulled the tools from the bag he had dropped earlier, unscrewed the cap of the radiator, and poured water carefully, steam rising into the night air. His movements were calm, efficient, his hands steady as always. The children watched him, the rhythm of his work soothing them, reminding them that even after chaos, order could be restored. Gina stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself, the bruises on her wrist faint but visible under the glow of the headlights. She watched her husband silently, the swell of pride and love in her chest almost too much to bear. He had come back, not with rage, but with the calm fury of discipline, and he had protected them all. She thought of the bikers, of their laughter, of the way they had scattered under his hand. They had underestimated the strength of this family, the strength of the man who led it. When the car finally coughed back to life, the sound of the engine humming steady once more, relief washed over them like a tide. The children cheered weakly, clapping their hands together, their voices carrying a note of triumph. Chuck closed the hood, wiped his hands against his jeans, and turned back to them. His face was calm, but his eyes softened as he looked at each of them in turn. "Let's go home," he said simply. They climbed back into the car, the children huddled close in the back seat, Gina settling once more into the passenger seat beside him. As the wheels rolled back onto the road, the dust trailing behind them, the night seemed calmer, more still. The cicadas continued their song, the stars shone brighter, and the moon cast a silver sheen across the fields. For a long stretch they rode in silence, the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of tires against asphalt the only sounds. The children dozed slowly, their heads leaning against each other, exhaustion finally pulling them into restless sleep. Gina turned her head toward Chuck, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You saved us," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "We saved each other. You kept them steady." Dakota stood his ground. The girls showed courage. That's what matters. Her eyes glistened again, but she said nothing more. His words were always simple, yet they carried the kind of truth that cut deeper than anything else. The road stretched before them, endless, dark but familiar. Trouble might return as it always did, circling back like wolves in the night, but the foundation of their family had been tested and had not broken. Instead, it had grown stronger, bound tighter. As the children slept and Gina leaned lightly against his shoulder, Chuck's eyes flicked briefly to the horizon. The echo of the leader's last words still lingered in his mind. This isn't over. He knew it wasn't an empty threat, but he also knew something far greater. No matter how many storms rose against them, no matter how many enemies tried to break their peace, his family would never face it alone. His hands tightened gently on the wheel, guiding them forward. The night was quiet now, the storm behind them, and in the silence after the chaos, the strength of what they had endured together glowed brighter than any fear. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the road stretched on, the Norris family moved into the future, united, unbroken, and unafraid. Don't stop here, the story only gets better. Hit subscribe now so you never miss the next twist. Check out our other videos packed with moments you won't believe, and share this one with your friends so they can join the journey too. You'll want to be the first to know what happens next.